was nice of you to play along.
You're on.
Nope, that wasn't a knock.
Yes.
It was. Good afternoon. It is Monday, May 14th, and this is the Administrative Committee of the Moscow City Council. To my right is Councilor Art Bedke, and to my left is Councilwoman Ann Zabala. Our first item is the approval of the Administrative Committee meeting minutes from April 23rd of this year. Any complaints? Okay, we like those. Our second item is medical insurance review and direction. Mr. Reedner.
Thank you very much. As you saw from our agenda today, we have two items, both fairly significant. The first being the medical insurance, self-insurance concept. Second being the reformation of our zoning code. Both are pretty voluminous, so we'll try and get through these as quickly as possible. We'll get through them today. We also will have a presentation to the entire council on the 21st of May to gain direction. So this is trying to give you a background, have some excellent written materials as well. First off, let me introduce Chad Murray and Nellie Armstrong of Murray Group out of Coeur d'Alene, who's been our health insurance benefits or employee benefits consultants for about 11 years, formerly Helbling Benefits Group.
Okay.
And they've worked with us on an employee benefits committee, helping coordinate that, looking at our entire employee benefits package for about the last year and a half. What you have before us today, or before you today, is a proposal background for self-insurance. Self-insurance for medical care has been one of those things that we've toyed with for some time. The concept is not new to Idaho. City of Burley, City of Lewiston have had it for quite a while. Self-insurance is just a way for us to perhaps gain some additional accountability and sustainability in our employee health insurance. One of the things that we've experienced in the past, depending on what year, seems like our health insurance premium increases, which are a factor of inflation, interest rates, employee experience, how often we use those benefits, we end up paying an increase virtually every year. I think we've only had 1 year since I've been with the city, 27 years, that we did not have a health insurance benefits or premium increase. Seen it as high as 20%, 21%, and as low as 3% on occasion. But the issue that we get into is how do we make it as sustainable as possible? In other words, how do we maintain the benefits we can in a manner which is affordable for the city, it's efficient for the city, and it also protects the employees' health benefits. So one of the things that we were looking at is there a way to pursue a self-insured model which may give us some additional leverage, some additional tools to try and maintain that, provide those employee benefits and some sustainability for the city. Since we're fairly short on time, I'll turn it over to Chad to go ahead and lead the discussion. I would encourage you, if you have questions, we'll have to go through it fairly quickly. This presentation took anywhere from an hour and a half to 2 hours. We presented to our city management team as well as the employee benefits and the employee advisory committees at noon. So we'll go through it pretty quickly. If you have questions, we'd ask that you ask them as they come up so we can keep the flow of the conversation going.
All right.
Thanks, Gary. Are we using this power? You guys can't see this, so I'll flip through it though so you know where we're at. Is that okay? And we can follow along from here too if we don't want to look up there. But Gary had asked me to go through the process that we've taken so far, probably over the last 6 to 8 months, just in kind of a discovery phase. So we'll kind of talk a little bit how we got to where we're at now, talk about a timeline if we were to go this route, and then we'll talk a little bit about experience. That's really how the plan currently is performing as far as claims and dollars and the financial piece of that. And then we'll have questions, but like Gary said, just ask me questions anytime. So when we take groups through kind of a benefit strategy development, we'd like to take them through a couple different phases. And the first phase is really to kind of find out the vitals for change. You know, is the group willing to make some changes, or do they want to continue to do the same thing they've been doing going forward? And I think in the health insurance world, that's there's a lot more challenges coming, and there's already been a lot of challenges. So if employers continue to do things the same way, I think they're and not willing to make change, I think they're going to have some issues going forward with the cost. And then market trends. After healthcare reform passed in 2010, there was some good that came from that. But there was also some outcomes that they weren't able to foresee, and some of those were some of the additional taxes on employers, and then some of the individual markets actually in the insurance industries. It upset those markets, and so we think it put upward pressure on the group market for some of these carriers. So like the Regencies of the world, as their individual markets were getting sicker potentially, the next place they're going to look to potentially make any is their group side. So we're starting to see a lot more employers go self-funded, and I'll explain what that is. So the city is currently fully insured, and we'll spend some time kind of explaining what that self-insured piece is. And then phase 2 here, baseline, is kind of what we're doing today, get input from the different stakeholders. We had a meeting this morning with the managers, and then at noon we had a meeting with some of the employee advisory group and the benefits committee. And then, of course, we're here meeting with you, and so we're gathering information and kind of explaining our process going forward. And then depending on what happens the next couple of weeks, we have a go-forward strategy. We'll kind of explain that timeline. And then we've already evaluated some approaches we think you should go. But so that's kind of the process we've taken so far. But as we went through the process, these are some of the things that we wanted to make sure we kept in mind. We want to hopefully keep an affordable benefits package for all employees, including their dependents. Employee choice, we think employee choice is important, and that means, potentially down the road offering another plan within the plan. So right now you offer one health insurance plan, potentially might offer another one, because it's really hard to try to meet everybody's need within an employee population. You have some families, some single folks, and different things. So, so we're trying to keep those things in mind. We want to make sure that whatever changes we make are still relevant to the employees, and we're not doing anything too drastic, too fast. We want to keep a competitive benefits package, and with the tightening labor market, and as all of you know, it's hard to find talent out there, and more for our employers, we're hearing them say that people are asking about benefits first. Not always necessarily about salaries, but they want to make sure that companies have good benefits programs. So trying to keep that relevant so you continue to compete in the workforce. Promote well-being with the employees. We want to have a culture of wellness around here also. I think that's important just for the longevity of employees and the engagement of your employees. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. And then obviously managing the cost and the budget is very important. You got to keep that in mind whenever. Best-in-class services, of course. We want to continue. Just because we're going self-funded doesn't mean we're not going to offer some of the same best-in-class things that you've already provided your employees. So. And then kind of this triple aim that we refer to in the industry is, improve the health of the employees when possible, improve the overall patient experience, and improve the sustainability of the healthcare program. And I think throughout this, we use the word sustainability because that's really, when I sat down with Gary and talked about, where the city may want to go in the future, and its benefits are just getting more expensive. So what are the options to make this thing as sustainable for as long as possible? So that was really one of the main things that we focused on. Cost priorities, keep healthcare spending below a determined threshold. So we're going to try in the self-funded world, you can do some different things to try to beat the cost curve. In most fully insured environments, and I'll explain again what the self-insured is in a minute. But a fully insured environment, that's like the Regencies and the Blue Crosses of the world taking all the risk, and they develop their own trends. And trends right now are anywhere from 8 to 12%. So that's just if all the utilization stays the same cost of services is 8 to 12% higher every year. And so they're just applying those trends to their entire book of business. Whether those trends are accurate or not, you never really know, but that's how they're approaching their business. So we want to try to beat those trends. We want to try to minimize just passing more costs down onto the employees, although at some point that may be something we have to do, but we want to try to minimize that as best as we can. And then develop and expand upon a value-based care model. And that's a little more technical term as far as networks and things like that. I won't go into too much detail, but that's really maximizing the access to care and the pricing that comes along with that. Just because a big, broad network we feel like that's important. That's not always the cheapest option. We're not looking at doing anything like that in the short term, messing with that model, but those are some of the industry things that are going on. And then ongoing evaluation of innovative cost containment strategies. So in a fully insured world, you pay your premium, you write your check every month to that carrier, and they kind of take care of all that. It becomes their money at that point. And a self-insured world, it really is your money, and we'll talk about that again. But doing some more cost containment things to bolt onto that and be a little more, have some more stewardship of that money versus just writing a check every month, we think is important. So, and then employee priorities, maximize employee benefit choice, of course. Empower employee benefit accountability. So this is another thing that I'm going to talk about in the presentation, but when you go self-funded, we really want the employees to be engaged. You know, that kind of goes hand in hand with being self-funded and being stewards of the city's money, and I'll talk a little more detail about that. Offer programs to support employee health improvement, and then the last bullet there, access to consumer-driven engagement tools. So it's not necessarily employees' fault that they haven't been engaged in the healthcare space, because we haven't given them the tools to do that. It's kind of like going and buying a set of tires. We know how to do that. We know how to shop and figure that out. Not everybody has been conditioned to maybe shop around for their health insurance. So we want to try to drive that into into the culture at some point, especially if we go self-funded. So these are just some of the things that we kept in mind as we were talking about this process. And then as we break up, I try to break up this health insurance thing and health plan into a little bit more of a digestible category. So care delivery, you can think of that as, that's the network. So right now, the city uses Regence's PPO network, and so that really is the network. And there's all kinds of things you can do within a network space, but that's, when we talk about network, that's kind of the care delivery. That's how the employees, where they go to get their care. And then employee health, that's things that employers can do to influence employees to be, better educated on their health, better educated on how to spend their healthcare dollars. And those are all those things that kind of fit in that bucket there. Program design we refer to as, that's like the plan design. That's like deductibles, co-pays, those types of things. Contribution strategies, that's what this, the city contributes, those types of things. Eligibility, all those kinds of things, the VIBA that you guys use, we kind of consider those kind of in that program design area. And then delivery infrastructure, that's really is how an employer organizes to deliver the finance of benefits. So this is where really the dollars are. So whether it's, we have a lot of things listed here, but this is really where the mechanism of how the plan gets funded. And that's where we're going to spend kind of our time in that self-funded versus fully insured here. Any questions so far? I'm kind of trying to go kind of quickly. So
What's PPO?
Preferred Provider Network. Organization,
Network,
yeah. PPN, yeah.
And-
So I am going to probably throw out a couple acronyms, so please stop me. But
Okay.
each insurance carrier has a network and usually it's PPO is their preferred network, and that's a contract that they'll have with like Gritman or like with different providers on reimbursement of things. So whatever procedures are in there, they'll have kind of a reimbursed amount versus you going in off the street. They've got that preferred amount. So good question. Sorry.
It's all right.
Okay, so self-funded. So I'm going to kind of spend just a little bit of time kind of explaining how your contract is structured now versus what the self-funded would look like. And I think the biggest thing is right now you pay somebody else, the city pays somebody else to take all the risk. So once you write that check to Regents every month, they take on all the risk for those claims that could be paid according to the contract. In a self-funded world, the city actually takes on the risk of that. So and I'll explain how we're going to mitigate some of that risk. But that's essentially what you're doing. You're really paying Regents to do the risk now. We're going to kind of take some of that risk back. And there's several different ways you can self-fund. What we're suggesting on a go-forward basis from here is what we call administrative services only, an ASO contract. And then there's also a third-party administrator contract called TPA, and then there's what we call self-administer. So the ASO contract that's Regents, just like what you have now, but you're self-funded. But we pay them to pay your claims and do all that kind of administrative stuff. In a third-party administration scenario, there are third-party administrators that aren't fully insured carriers like Regents or Blue Cross, and they'll just pay your claims on your behalf. We call that the unbundled approach. And then there's actually some employers that self-administer their claims, which is not what you want to do, but that's out there. That'd be like somebody coming in and handing you their explanation of benefits to have you pay their claims for them, and you don't want to know what's going on as far as claims. So what we're talking about doing is this administrative services only contract, and that really is, the look and feel is very much like what it is today with Regents. And you guys have been with Regents, I think, since '96. Gary says 2001, so it's somewhere a long time, which actually is it's positive. I've seen a lot of groups that jump around, carrier hop, try to chase the dollar a little bit, and put their employees through that. So what we're going to propose is an ASO type arrangement with Regents where, and I'll explain some of their details, but they're going to be the claim, we're going to call them the claims payer. And then I'll explain a little bit more. And then we're also going to purchase what we call, well, so this is we're going to pay them administrative fee, that's the next, and then they're going to develop an expected claim rate. So today, when Gary comes to the council to get the budgets approved on the health insurance, Regents has said, this is what it's going to cost for me to cover your employees for the next 12 months. And you guys approve that. We're going to do a very similar thing. We're going to have an expected claim rate. So we're going to say, this is what we think it's going to, the actuaries are going to say, this is what it's going to be we think to cover your employees. So we're still going to have that portion of it. But what we're going to do to protect the exposure of the city is we're going to purchase stop-loss insurance. So none of these terms now have anything to do with what the employee's experience is. Their deductibles, that kind of stuff, that's kind of put that aside. This is kind of on the back end. So the city will purchase, they'll pay Regents they'll pay them an administrative fee to pay the claims, and then they're going to buy stop-loss insurance to protect you. So in an example, let's say a claim is $100,000. I'll show you an example in a second, but city will be responsible for the first $25,000, and Regents picks up the next $75,000. That's what we call the stop-loss deductibles, the $25,000. Whether you decide to do 25 or not, the actuaries are going to do some recommendations there. I think it'll be more like 50 or 75. But just for the sake of the example, you're on the hook for the first 25, the city is, the next is insured. And so it's basically, you don't cover that. You're paying a fee to cover that risk. And then we're also going to recommend aggregate stop-loss insurance. And so in the example that I just explained, an individual claim, this is if let's just say everybody hit their $25,000 claim, which is that'd be every city employee or, if it gets to a certain aggregate dollar amount, then you're covered for anything over that. So you're not only protecting yourself on an individual, you're protecting yourself on the aggregate. So, and as the plan matures, you may not need to purchase aggregate in the future if reserves and things are at a place where you feel comfortable. But in the beginning, it's worth spending a little bit of money to have the aggregate insurance. There's hardly ever aggregate claims, but it's just it's a peace of mind thing in case the wheels come off and everybody has a claim issue that year. So, not scaring anybody, am I?
A little bit, just a little bit.
Okay. Well, we'll get deeper and then hopefully we'll. Okay, here's I just gave kind of an example, this exact example. So that's pretty straightforward. And anything that's 20, like let's say the things that go to the aggregate level are anything up to that 25. So if it's at 50, everything up to that 50, wherever you set that at, that goes towards your aggregate number. And usually you set the aggregate at 125% of expected claims. So in the example, if the expected claims are $1 million, then you would set your aggregate at 1.25 million. So once you hit, let's say we think your claims are going to come in at $1 million. Worst case, it's 1.25 million, and then you're covered after that. There's no more exposure. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, so I'll maybe stop there and just before we go into the next category. Does that kind of make sense as far as how the insurance is going to be organized at a high level?
At a high level, so far so good.
Okay, and as far as the employees see and everybody else sees, it's going to look exactly the same. It's really a funding mechanism on the back end. There is a trust that's created that we'll go into some more detail about that. And so so I'll back up a little bit. The Department of Insurance will be regulating your health plan to make sure that you're doing all the right things. And so because you're a public entity, they don't allow just any public entity to go self-funded. They make sure you have all the right funding mechanisms in place in order for they say, yes, you can go ahead and do it. And so I don't know, Gary, if we want to explain a little bit about where that's at right now as far as the conversations we've had, but.
Oh, with the Department of Insurance?
Yeah.
Yeah, the Department of Insurance is as Chad said, regulates pretty heavily the way that public entities self-insure. Mainly because they want to make sure that, they're not getting pressure from the entity, the city council, to do certain things. You can keep buying from a fully insured carrier or get full insurance from a carrier. But if you're going to be self-insured, there are a lot of rules that you have to follow. One of the main ones is you need to make sure that you have a trust set up, that the funding for the entity is done within that trust, that money that is paid into the trust for premiums or contributions, premiums if it was a private insurer, contributions under the self-insured plan, that those funds are within the trust. So the city lets go of those at that time, administers it as a trust. So those funds are used for employee health benefits, either to pay claims, the premiums for the administration, the stop-loss insurance, or it can be used for other health care or health benefits for employees. So a trust would have to be set up that at this point we're looking at 5 members as members of the trust. Those would be representatives from finance, human resources, and other employees, likely administration, and then a couple of other employees as well. They administer the trust itself. And then you have the employer side, which would be the council. Since the council has the ultimate authority in approving the budget, no council member or elected official can serve on that trust. The idea is that you have somebody looking out for the trust assets and the plan itself, and the other who is funding that plan. So Department of Insurance, we had a meeting with them by telephone a couple of weeks ago, and they quizzed us back and forth as to what we understood. Did we really know what we were getting into? And is this something that we really wanted to do? And I thought the result was pretty positive. Murray Group's attorney, Josh Sears, was instrumental in doing that, and frankly has been instrumental in explaining how the trust works, how self-insurance works. And finally, after all these years, I'm pretty comfortable with how putting it forward.
Yeah, I know Gary and Josh from our office spent a lot of time making sure they understood the code and what's required of public entities when it comes to self-funding. And not to toot anybody's horn, but, the Department of Insurance was very pleased with the first call that we had. Sometimes they can be somewhat contentious because not everybody comes as prepared into those meetings, but they were impressed with how much the city knew at that first meeting. And they said they look forward to the application, so they never say that. So,
Wow,
yeah. Good start.
look at you.
So I thought that'd be helpful, just kind of understanding that trust part. And then, the other thing that some of the process we went through is just whenever we work with an employer that's self-insured, that's potentially going to go self-insured, these are some of the things that we like to ask, go through with them. And it's their risk tolerance. Some people are really just happy with writing that check to Regents or Blue Cross every month. And if you do better, they keep the money, and I'm okay because they took the risk. Some other people say, you know what, I don't want them to make any more money off me. I want to take a little bit more risk and take my plan self-funded. So we try to gauge that risk tolerance whenever we're working with the group. And really, when we got through those discussions with Gary and we talked about the stop loss and the aggregate insurance and some of the protections, you start to get a little more comfortable understanding really what your exposure is. It's not as bad as I think maybe is out there, so people think when you put those things in place. So,
From a practical standpoint, if I can just interject, as we've had these discussions, you talk to the professionals in health insurance, and they will typically tell you that, you will have a couple of bad years in a 10-year period. That's just the way it is. Sometimes you have a lot of claims one year. So 2 to 3 years, you can expect that you're at risk for having a year that you would spend more than what you've taken in premiums or contributions. The corollary to that is that there are 7 to 8 years that you are at or below your average, and you've collected more money than you pay out in payments or healthcare costs. In those cases, with Regents or any other private health carrier, they keep those as profits. I mean, they're working to have our employees are really good about utilizing their healthcare benefits wisely, and that's great. It's good for their health, but what it does is it means that the insurance company is paying out less in premiums. They don't give us a rebate back for that. What they do is they keep that as their profit, administrative fee, whatever. On the flip side, what it will do is hopefully, since our experience, the use of the insurance has been lower, then hopefully the next year our premium will have increased, and it's typically an increase, will increase at a slower rate. The other side of that, in those 2 to 3 bad years, on the average, couple bad years, then the insurance company, yeah, you've paid for that year, and you don't owe them any more money, no matter how much they pay out for that year. But the next year, when you go back in and get your premiums calculated, they look back and say, well, your experience last year was not very good. Increases risk to us, our premium is going to reflect that. So what we're trying to do is do the same thing the insurance company does, except we need to insure ourselves against those couple bad year possibilities. But the 7 to 8 years that we're going to be doing well, on the average, that those funds are retained in our trust so that we can use those for other health benefits, or we can use them to mitigate any increased premiums or contributions you need for future health care costs.
So how do we approach the issue of having enough money in the till to pay if we get tripped up with a couple of bad years right out the gate?
And that's a cash flow issue. We're still doing the financial analysis for that. But the Department of Insurance requires you to have a reserve. So we're currently researching that. We'll have a proposal out of finance to take a look at that and how we can fund that and how we should fund that. So again, what we're looking at is the concept now, and one thing that we'll get to, we would have by the end of the presentation, is what we're looking for is, does this look good to proceed? Get the actuarial data, continue, excuse me, springs always kill me, move forward. If it turns out that this is not a way we want to go, you always have the option of pulling out. But it allows us to move forward on a timeline that we'll talk about fairly quickly. But you'll be able to see everything, including hopefully what the contributions will be. I expect they won't be, well, I expect they'll be at or within the same ballpark as what we would expect in a premium increase.
And we'll show you at the end a 5-year snapshot of the history of the experience. So you can kind of see, you know, the trends and where it's headed. So,
but you've really hit on one of the points, Art, and that is it's a cash flow issue. Mm-hmm. You know, as you saw from one of the previous slides, that if we get into that, we still have to pay the bill.
Yeah.
So we go back to our stop-loss insurance and say, we had to cover that $100,000 bill for that hospital. Now you need to pay us back the 75 or whatever our stop-loss was. So you do have to have cash flow, and that's something we'll just, once we get the actuarial numbers, we'll be able to hopefully predict with a little more certainty as to what that is.
And cross our fingers we don't get a couple bad years right out.
Exactly.
well, and one of the things that I think we probably haven't talked about with Gary is in an ASO arrangement, once you hit that spec, they don't invoice you anymore for it. So that's kind of nice.
Cool.
If you're with a TPA and an unbundled approach, it's exactly what Gary said. $100,000 claim, you pay it, and then you wait a month or two to get reimbursed. In the ASO arrangement, they cut it off as soon as you hit your spec, which is kind of nice from a cash flow perspective.
Yes.
So we're just kind of talking about the historical claims experience. We'll talk about that. But these are the things that we look at when we're talking to an employer about potentially going self-fund. We want to know, how is their plan run historically? And, you know, if you look throughout the years, even though, you know, Gary mentioned a couple years in the 20s, you'll see in other years, it probably really is that 2 to 3 out of 10 as you look through the last 20 years. And that's typical across the board in most of our plans. So and the employer's workforce, you know, if you guys have a very stable workforce, you've had some retirements lately, but if we were talking to an employer that's got 40, 50% turnover, it probably may not be a good fit, because we don't, the risk of those employees, we know, the city of Moscow employees are known. We know your claims experience history, we kind of know how that functions. If there's employees coming in and out of the plan, we don't really know what that experience is going to look like. So a lot of turnover is not a good indicator for going self-funded. Rate and plan design history, you guys have had a long history of the same rate and plan design, or not rate, but plan design. The the philosophy of providing benefits, that's important when we're talking to employers. So, do I have to offer a plan to stay competitive, or I want to offer a plan to take care of my employers, or both? I mean, if we're talking to an employer that their philosophy doesn't really fit as far as why they're providing benefits, and they're not in it for the long run, probably isn't a good fit to go self-funded. Because of the next bullet point, this is, like Gary said, you can go into the self-funded world, and you can actually come back out. But if you're going to go into this, you want it to be a long-term approach. We want this to be a long-term health trust for many, many years, past all of us sitting here at this table. We want this trust to perpetuate way into the future. So,
An example of that, there was a time about 5 or 6 years ago when we went out because we felt Regents was not giving us what we thought was a good bid for next year's premium. So council gave direction to shop it around. So we did, went to Pacific Source, Blue Cross, and Regents. We got back a proposal from a competitor of Regents that there was a little savings there, but it would have required us to change carriers, change the process in which our employees who are very comfortable with Regents could move ahead. And one of the risks you have in those situations is that carrier just buying the business. So then the next year you're going to see a spike, and certainly the third year after that you're going to see another one. So we looked at it, went back to council and said, this is what we're weighing here. What do you think? And council's decision at that time was those couple of percentage points are not worth upsetting the entire employee base and how they move forward. And it's helped build us, and Chad is exactly right. We've had Regents since the mid-90s. So we are a well-known commodity to them, and I think with Murray's assistance throughout the years, we've had pretty good competitive rates. In this scenario, this isn't something that we're just, call it dipping the toe in the water. This is a lot of work to get this thing kicked off. And we want to look at it from a long-term concept to get that sustainable rate and those sustainable benefits. Doesn't say we can't. After a couple of years, it may be, whoa, this is too hot, we want out. We can always go back to buying from a carrier the full package. But we shouldn't be doing that as a way to leverage lower premiums in the meantime.
Right.
Either it's a philosophy we want to go forward with, or we should just stay with the fully funded carrier.
So why isn't every employer with a certain critical mass of employees not jumping off to this and staying with the other guys? Just the ease of write your checks and off you go?
it's kind of that risk tolerance a little bit. I mean, not everybody wants to take you are taking the fiduciary responsibility of the health plan at this point. And there, like Gary said, there's a lot of work it takes to get it to the point where you flip the switch, at least for a public entity. In the private world, you can go self-funded and not have the DOI kind of breathing down your neck. But there's a lot of work that's gone into just to get up to where we're at now, and then to go forward the next 6 months, there's quite a bit of work. So some of it, I think, is that, some is risk tolerance.
Yeah, if I may too. A lot of it, there is a tendency in government to take the safe route.
Yeah.
And there's some risk attached, but as you've seen, you can insure yourself against anything catastrophic. In the long run, we're convinced that there will be significant savings and allow us to provide a competitive benefit package far beyond what we think we can get out in the competitive marketplace. But it is going to take some work. And I think that's kind of the hallmark of some of the things that we've been encouraged to do, is to think outside the box, whatever you want to call it, but to maximize those opportunities. And so I think it's a great idea to flesh it out, see if it works, and then give it a go.
And the other thing that we talk to employers about, kind of the last bullet point on this page, is really promoting that wellness, that employee engagement. I think if you're going to go self-funded, you'd be remiss not to invest time and even money to this, because now it really is the employee's plan at that point. It's the City of Moscow's Employees Health Trust, and everybody needs to be good stewards of that. And so that culture, if it's not already here, it needs to, we want to make sure employers are moving in that direction. So.
Right.
So the next slide, just really, it's pros and cons. We've talked about some of these, pros, cash flow, under the current fully insured arrangement, there are monthly premium payments, and a self-funded, the city holds reserve. So what we mean by this, we look at this as a pro, because if if you pay that $100,000 a month to Regents, but there's only 40,000 in claims that month, they keep all that money. So on the flip side, there could be $140,000 a month, and you know, and you might only, but in this situation, if claims are coming in lower, the city holds those reserves. They hold that money. Plan design, flexibility and control. When you go self-funded, right now you're purchasing that plan from Regents, and so they say these are the plans these are the only options you have. It's not as flexible. In a self-funded world, you actually have a lot more flexibility. I think in the beginning, the city's not going to, do too much as far as that, but you have that ability. Cost efficiencies, monthly claims reconciliation and competitive administrative fees. What we're talking about here is taking the profit out of the insurance carrier, so being cost efficient. And I don't necessarily blame the insurance carriers necessarily. They're taking the risk, but if they're not anymore, they're not going to have that profit built in. So, and then not subject to most state mandated benefits. So this doesn't apply as much to the state of Idaho. Idaho has like the least. They're one of the states that has the least amount of mandated benefits, where like Washington has 46 mandated benefits, one being like massage, which is great, but in self-funded world, you don't have to adhere to some of those things. You can actually get out of doing some of those. But in Idaho, there's not that many, and the ones that are mandated you're already doing those. So the employer holds the reserves, we talked about that. Expanded availability of reporting. This doesn't necessarily mean as much to the city of Moscow. We get all your data already. So we get your claims experience. Some fully insured carriers don't give any data at all. So you don't know what kind of claims experience you're having, what's going on. And when I say get your data, it's data that's non-member specific. It's all aggregate level. So all I know is that somebody had a knee surgery. We don't know who it was. We just know where they went and how much it cost and those kinds of things. So for some, it's expanded reporting. And then the elimination of state premium taxes, and then also the ACA tax. So this is something that just comes right off the top right away. So within your premium with Regents, you pay a 1.5% state tax that goes straight to the state, and then you pay an insurance carrier ACA fee as part of healthcare reform to help pay for healthcare reform. And it's anywhere from 3 to 5% depending on the carrier, and they just pass it right on to you. So right off the bat, you're going to experience either 4.5 to 6% of savings right away when you go self-funded. Minimal impact on plan participants in your guys' situation. The employees would know no different if we flip the switch tomorrow and change this to self-funded. They would get a new card because your group number changes, but other than that, it's still a Regents card, everything's the same. So minimal impact. Stable workforce predictable claims, we kind of talked about that. Flexibility and choice of carriers, vendors. So when you go self-funded, you actually opens up this big tool chest of options in the world. Not all of them fit for Moscow. In the beginning, we're not going to even go into that tool chest. We're basically going to go the ASO route, stay with Regents, see how it goes, get the funding going, get the reserves going, get things stable. And then at some point, there are lots of things we can start to take a look at as far as cost containment and cost management stuff. So, and the next slide is the cons. That claims fluctuation, and I'll show you an example here at the end that explains that a little bit more. But one of the cons is, like I said, you pay that $100,000 to the carrier. You don't really necessarily care that month on the claims fluctuation. In a self-insured world, you do care about the because the cash flow is going to potentially be up and down a little bit. In some cases, there's more involvement required by the city's human resources or finance staff. I think actually for human resources, it really shouldn't be a whole lot of anything. There won't be a lot of change. The employees are going to roll the same. The billing, potentially a little bit different than the billing for finance, but finance is going to have a little bit of change, but once that change is there, it shouldn't really create too much more work. We're going to pay Regents to do some of those management pieces where some employers actually take those on themselves. And then HIPAA compliance responsibilities, there really is no change for you here because you're already compliant with HIPAA. Regents is going to continue to keep you HIPAA compliant. They're not going to give you information on Gary's claims or anything like that. You won't know who they are. But in some parts of the self-insured world, that data can be sent around, so you need to make sure you have a HIPAA compliance area. And then legal and fiduciary responsibility. Art, you asked, why aren't more people doing this? One of them really is that fiduciary responsibility. It scares people until they can kind of understand a little bit more. But that's seen as a con. You're taking on that fiduciary reliability. And to get this thing up and going, there's some legal work that takes place. So those are kind of a quick snapshot of the pros and cons. Is that We're doing good on time and everything?
Yeah, you got about 10 minutes left.
Okay. Nellie, do you want to talk about the timeline here a little bit?
Yeah.
And,
So Gary and Chad both talked a little bit about the call with the DOI. So our office called the Department of Insurance and just let them know the city was looking at going self-funding, which then prompted a call with all of us, and that call went very well. As Chad mentioned, they said they're looking forward to the application from the city if you decide to proceed, so that's a great thing. The next kind of step towards the end of May, beginning of June, will be the selection of the trustees for the City of Moscow Health Insurance Trust. And Gary talked about the makeup of those trustees, so 5 trustees. After those are selected, there'll be a couple of things that have to happen. The DOI will request a call with the city, our office, and those trustees. They want to make sure that the trustees understand their fiduciary responsibility, and they also have to fill out biographical affidavits along with financial history. So it's a pretty serious step to engage those trustees over the trust. But we talked about in our last meetings, just you'd want to make sure that somebody is financially sound if they're helping manage $1 million trust. So. Once the actuaries have evaluated all the data, we will be sending the self-funded application and the actuarial analysis for what your premiums need to be funded at to the Department of Insurance. At that point, it takes about 90 days for them to kind of sift through all the information we give them. There's a list of over 20 things that they require along with that actuarial analysis and plan documents and all kinds of things. And then at that same time, we'll be giving options to the City of Moscow on various plan designs and recommendations. So it would be almost like your fully insured renewal where we're saying, here's some things that you could do with your plan design if you'd like to make changes, like change your deductible to $750, for example, things like that. We'll give some options there. And then throughout the fall, the Department of Insurance will continue to ask for updated data, most likely. So they're going to want to make sure before they give their final stamp of approval and say the funding should be set at X, they want to make sure that they know where your claims data has been running so that they can set those actuarial amounts. And then our goal would be to have the plan approved by November. With a self-funded go-live date of 1/1/19. So this is quite the process to get it to that point. And that would be, we've talked a little bit about whether, that has to be the date. That doesn't necessarily have to be the date. That would be that's the date we're working towards, so.
I mean, one thing Nellie didn't mention is I talked to the council several weeks ago about actuary data. The Murray Group does most of the analysis that's done, but they do contract with an actuary who has to go through our claims, our demographics, employee sorts of things, and will come back with that's some of the information they need to determine what our predicted contribution level will be, as well as a bunch of other information. That's about somewhere around a $15,000 exercise, but we need that information going forward. I've already identified funding out of administration for that, and we knew that's what was going to go on coming in. Nellie also mentioned that throughout the fall, we'll be talking about any plan issues. As you know, we've got not a complex health benefits plan, but the council does grant in their annual budget, has granted a VEBA contribution, voluntary employee benefit account contribution. Currently, we have a $300 deductible for our insurance, which is a very good deductible, but it's one that we've talked about for years. We need to adjust, and we need to discuss it in terms of the VEBA. So that discussion will go on as well, because we want to go in with as much information as we can and the best scenario that works for our employees and for the city going in. So this sort of thing, these sort of discussions have been going on for many years. So it's nice moving it forward at this point.
How does this fit in with our budget process? Because it sounds like we're not going to know how much this is apt to cost until after we've passed a budget. What do we do with that?
We'll have that information not entirely before the budget process, but we are renewing our we will renew our contract with Regents under the traditional plan. That will all be budgeted for. We proceed with that, and which will be in effect until the go-live date on the self-insurance. So that amount will put us through. If it turns out that there's something that's going to cost thousands of dollars more and the council doesn't want to open the budget for us, then we just play it out through the next budget year and proceed at that time. I don't anticipate that will be the case with the anticipated efficiencies we're going to see by contracting for our administration with Regents, rather than having Regents do the administration, and any savings under there, they retain themselves.
Yep.
So we're confident there will be, it'll be a good, flat type situation where it won't cost a bunch of money up front.
Flat to better, maybe even.
That's the hope.
Yeah.
But we'll continue to develop that.
Okay, thanks.
So to kind of wrap things up, the last couple slides here are, we call this kind of your experience dashboard. So we monitor your experience on a monthly basis and report to the administration, kind of on how the plan is running. Even when you're fully insured, we want to know so we can anticipate renewals and see what's going on within the plan. And so just real briefly, I won't go through all this because I want to look at the next slide real quick that I think will be more useful. But, you know, we track employee members. So at the top left corner, you've got 147 folks enrolled. Last year at the same time was 148. And the period we're looking at is August 17 to March 18. So it's this plan year, 7 months so far, to the prior plan month. And you can kind of see down through here, medical claims at 631,000 for this plan year. Last plan year was 738, so that was they're down about 14.5%. Pharmacy claims are up quite a bit actually, and we know kind of what's going on there. I won't go into some of the detail there just because of some of the claim specific stuff, but there are some things that came through that that we don't think will continue to happen, but those are something we're going to continue to watch as pharmacy, just like we always do. And then we kind of come up with this medical pharmacy PEPM, kind of at the bottom box. That's kind of how we normalize it with the enrollment. And you can say we're up.
PM being,
Oh, I'm sorry, what was that?
PEPM being,
Oh, I'm sorry. Per employee per month.
Thank you, Gary.
Thanks, Gary. So I think what I want to do is let's just skip to the next page, just given time, because this is going to be really the point we want to talk about it. So you can see this experience period here.
you need to switch slides.
Okay. So all the way on the left-hand side is November 2014, and then you can see it goes to March 2018. That red line that goes through the middle is what we really consider as your expected claims. That's where we estimate where you're going to come in at, or that's what Regents says you're going to come in at. That line that takes off and kind of goes down, that's your trend line. And that trend line basically takes all these months of experience. So you can see, if you go all the way to the left, November 2014, your loss ratio was 66%. And your loss ratio is, for every dollar that the city pays Regents, they paid out 66 cents in claims.
Interesting.
So if you can see, so everywhere you see a number like 85 in the next month, that was your loss ratio that much. So you can see how much it fluctuates. And you can see month of, I think that's March of 15, went up to 179% one month. And we're going to see that. I mean, that's the cash flow issues that potentially could be there. But you can see all these other ones. You know, we're budgeting that red line, but we're paying where these are coming in at. So I thought this was a good kind of sample of where your experience has been over the last 5 years.
If I could borrow your pointer.
Yeah, you're definitely not trending up. You're trending down, which is positive.
And if you look at that November 14 to November 15, right here, your average is probably just about where you are. So it looks bad on a month-by-month basis, but as you average it, it becomes something a little more manageable. Then if you get to, say, November 15 to November 16, you have very little. Great plan year that year. We didn't see a huge increase in premiums except for inflation and that sort of thing, but the experience rate was actually pretty manageable at that time.
So that's a year you would have put some money away
Yep.
in reserves. And then the next year it looks like also.
Same thing.
Yeah. So this is just to be illustrative on how kind of the plan's been experiencing. Any other
Yeah, if I could, in conclusion, fairly quickly, since I know Mike's ready to jump in here and wow you with planning and zoning stuff. We'll yield the floor to him here in a second. Again, this is part of the challenge. As you saw in the packet, there is a major challenge area in our HR department to look at some ways to stabilize employee benefits. This is one of those first things. We're also looking at other things such as our VIVA program. We're looking at sick leave, those sorts of things, just as a regular way to determine whether or not our benefits are accurate, whether they're adequate, and those sorts of things. So we think this is a very we're excited about the program, fleshing it out and bringing further information forward, mainly because we think we can control costs while maintaining, as long as possible, the best benefits we can for our employees. So we will be bringing this back to you. If you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to send them to me or send them to Jen. We will get them to Chad and Nellie. We'll be coming back to you on the 21st, looking for the entire council to give us the go-ahead on it, just so you know what's happening as we go through. As I indicated before, there's nothing saying, I mean, we could go through if there's something the council doesn't like, we can always abandon it at that point and continue with our carrier that we have now. But we think you're going to be as excited about it as we are as a way of maintaining benefits.
Yep, I think it's a great idea, and I think the employees have been doing their part by increasing the wellness within the city staff, and I think they should probably be able to reap some benefit from that that they aren't seeing right now. So I think that's another incentive to go this route.
Great, thank you.
Chad, Nellie, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. That very last graph was the great closer. It's a great closer.
I would actually like to see some additional historical data beyond 2014.
And we'll be developing that.
Perfect.
Thank you. Madam Chair, if I could have the Assistant City Supervisor sit in for the rest of the
Absolutely,
meeting.
sir.
Thank you.
Okay, our next item on our agenda is the amendment of Title IV, Chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 11, and 12 of Moscow City Code regarding the use table ordinance. Mike Ray, couldn't just do one. You had to do a whole bunch of chapters, sir.
Had to do almost all of them.
Welcome, Jen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ready, you're welcome.
So this is a project, I think internally, we've probably been working on for 2-3 years in planning and zoning for the last year and a half. Really, what we're trying to accomplish here is changing from more of a narrative format of our zoning code into more of a use table format. And so you see a rather large ordinance in front of you. A lot of that is duplicate language where we're taking it from one place and relocating it into another. And so that's really the reason for just the length of the ordinance itself. And I won't bore you with going through page by page of the ordinance, but I think the best thing to do, to really put in perspective exactly what we're doing is look at the table of contents and kind of what I've laid out to you within the memo that's attached to your packet today, and just go through chapter by chapter and really just explain, what exactly is going on, what's being moved, what's a new section. And so I'll just give you kind of an overview of these different sections, and if you have any specific questions, we can certainly turn to the page and talk a little bit more about each particular section. So starting out in Chapter 1, really go through our general provisions, and not a whole lot has changed in this chapter except for the incorporation of the definitions. So generally within all zoning codes, you usually try to locate your definitions to the easiest place possible in order for people to be able to find them. And so previously we had them in Chapter 11, which is towards the end of our zoning code. Currently it's 12 chapters, and really wanted to relocate those in very beginning of the zoning code for just ease of use. And the other kind of substantive change that we've made within the definition section is the conversion to the NIACS, which is North American Industry Classification System. And so that's how the federal government classifies business establishments in the United States, also covers Canada and Mexico. And so throughout the United States or North America, it's really pretty common for all these business establishments to be given a NIACS code, and it also provides a pretty high level of detail of which business establishments are included within different NIAC sectors. And so that's really been the major change within Chapter 1 is the moving of definitions and then just the NIAC's conversion to commercial. Chapter 2 was formerly residential zoning districts, and so we've replaced that with just zoning districts. So we had Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. Chapter 3 was dedicated to commercial zoning districts, and we've shifted a lot of those commercial zones into Chapter 2, and so they're all in one location. So we go through establishment of zoning districts, adoption of the Moscow zoning map. These are all the same. They've just been relocated from Chapter 1. Rules for determination of zoning districts. We had a lot of these different sections that were just in different areas and just kind of moving these into areas that made the most sense on where to find them. So we're moving section 2-3 from Chapter 11 and district purposes. And so the major change here is we've got all residential zoning districts, we've got all commercial zoning districts, and previously we had all the allowed uses, all the conditional uses, all the setback requirements, lot size requirements, limitations on use requirements. And so we've tried to break a lot of those out into table format. And so what that leaves you with is purpose statements. So right now, when the beginning of each of those sections for residential or commercial uses, we have a purpose statement. And so those are largely remaining the same. There's not too many that are changing. That really guides you, as well as the comprehensive plan, into the appropriate locations where zoning districts are appropriate in town. And so we want to retain those and provide the description of the zones. So we go through pretty much all the existing zones that we have, from ag forest all the way to multifamily residential on the residential side. Commercial, like I said, we're relocating those from Chapter 3 and just keeping the purpose statements. So we've got, run the gamut of all of our commercial zones. Those aren't changing at all. University zone, that was previously in Chapter 4. So we had a Chapter 4 that was dedicated really to special zoning districts, and we just had University and Legacy Crossing, solely dedicated to one chapter. So we've relocated, University underneath all the rest of the zones, and then we've created a new section for overlay and specific plan districts. Our Legacy Crossing Overlays District is not really a zone, it's an overlay district. And so we've created this section, kind of gives an general provisions. Those provisions explain really the relationship between the overlay zone and the underlying zoning district. And so right now we've got Legacy Crossing overlay, but it does have urban mixed commercial zone underneath it. So just how those two relate to each other, which takes precedence in the circumstance where there's some type of redundancy there. And so we explain that in subsection A, and then we list our only overlay district, Legacy Crossing. And so as we move into the future, and there may be other overlay districts that we end up establishing for whatever reason, this would be the location where you would list those as well. So that concludes Chapter 2. Chapter 3, where we previously had all the commercial zones listed. So now we just talk about permitted land use. And we have the introduction of the land use table. So this is all new. This is setting the tone for our land use table, where we've included all the permitted uses, conditional uses, all the zones. And so we talk about it, interpretation, explaining all the different acronyms. So P, permitted, C, conditional, PA, permitted accessory use, and so on. So we have an interpretation there. And then move into authorized uses, which has stayed the same, relocated from Chapter 11. And then we introduced the land use table. So this is pretty much the final draft version of the land use table. Planning and zoning has spent a great deal of time, formatting this. You can see, and if you look at a lot of other jurisdictions, land use table, and I guess I'm biased a little bit, but this is, it looks a lot better and is a little more easier to navigate than some other jurisdictions for their table. So it runs, you have the different zones across the top. You've got all the listed uses. We started residential uses. And so you can easily go across, fraternity, sorority, what are we looking for? Different zones. Well, R4, it's a conditionally permitted use in that zone. So it's kind of a one-stop shop for, finding and cross-referencing the use to the zone. Then we move into non-residential uses. This is where we start to get into more of the NIAX numbers. So you can see the 2012 code. Easy reference, and if you need to go and look that up on the Census Bureau's website for more detail. And we've also got the grouping based upon category. So depending upon what use you're looking for, you would just scroll to the appropriate, if you're looking at opening a fitness center, it's going to be an amusement recreation facilities, you'd scroll down fitness center, and then you go across and you can see which zones, pretty much all commercial over here where they're allowed, but it gives you a nice central location in order to be able to find this. Instead of previously, what you had was looking through the narrative version of our zoning code and going zone by zone to see if there's a permitted use. And so the efficiency here for staff, anybody working with it, is going to be greatly improved. So just going down, so a few pages of residential uses. And then we do have some use exceedance elements at the very bottom, so like drive-through facilities, not necessarily a use, just a component of a use. And then exceedance of maximum building height for permitted non-residential uses. And so a lot of times what we previously do before, process it through a variance, which really wasn't intended for a variance. Variances are a lot higher of a standard than a conditional use permit. And so a lot of the churches, these institutional uses, government offices, churches, schools, are almost always exceeding the height of the underlying zone because they're most of the time in a residential area. And so we're incorporating this, at the end of the use table here, and that shows you which zones allow for it. And then at the very bottom, we have a lot of these, footnotes. So there's a lot of these superscripts that you see. These numbers are just little, special requirements, nuances of certain portions of the use table. And you can see all those described here at the very bottom. And so you would just look at the superscript here and then look at the footnote down at the bottom, which correlates to that. So moving on, so after the use table, we have specific use standards. So a lot of the requirements within our use table, you see a lot of these footnotes refer to specific use standards. So like number 1 is just all of our specific use standards. So this previously used to be in chapter 12. Pretty much the whole chapter was dedicated towards specific use standards. Thought that it'd be more of appropriate location to right after the use table be able to see what those standards are. And so we're pretty much shifting those all from chapter 12 to right after the use table. So we've got ADUs, home occupations, child care facilities. Drive-through facilities is one that we're adding, and so that's a new standard that's been developed. Right now, we don't have a standard for drive-through facilities, so how many cars are required to queue in front of a drive-through window? And there's been quite a bit of popularity for certain drive-through establishments, and so we've wanted to take a look at developing some standards in order to make sure there's sufficient queuing and landscaping and so prevent queuing from going out into the public right-of-way or ITD's right-of-way, and so those have been incorporated, and those are new. Educational services, pretty much just elementary and secondary schools. Those were previously in Chapter 6, and we did our off-street parking standards ordinance. We ended up removing those with the intention of inserting them here. And so right now, these are just being reinserted within Chapter 3, and they're not changing at all. They're staying the same to what we currently have. So just rounding out the remainder of the specific use standards, we've got gardens, large retail establishments and telecommunication facilities, and then temporary uses, as well as townhouses, and these have all been moved from Chapter 12, largely stayed the same. And then limitations on uses. So, there's certain restrictions that each zone has, or most zones have, I should say. that were previously listed underneath zone, and so what we've done now is just consolidated those into one table. I don't think any of them have changed. They've just been put into table format. And then our performance standards, so smoke, dust, vibration, glare, things like that, pretty much being moved from Chapter 6, but remaining the same. And this is what our limitations on use table looks like. So same format as the use table. You can navigate by the top bar here that has all the zones, and then all those different nuances for each zone would be listed on the left, and then the X marks where it applies or where it doesn't apply. So pretty simple there. And then, so Chapter 4, so this was previously our university zone, legacy crossing, special use, zoning districts chapter. So now this is bulk and replacement regulations. So this is setbacks, lot size, building height, lot area, lot width, things of that nature. We needed an introductory paragraph in order to explain what setbacks are, what's within this chapter. And then we introduced the bulk and placement regulations table. And so, those things that I just mentioned are all consolidated into the one table instead of just broken out under, like, again, each individual zone. So it makes it a lot easier to navigate. And this is what it looks like. So once again, got all the zones on the top, go through all the different types of building construction here. A lot of our lot area, lot width, will change depending upon whether or not you have a single family, a twin home, or a townhouse, two-family dwelling, or multifamily dwelling. So I have to specify that there, but you can easily go across and see, what the minimum lot size is, depending upon what zone you're in. Same with lot width, same with setback requirements, and we have some exceptions to minimum setbacks listed above, and those are all listed down here as well. As far as a common open space requirement, we've got that listed down at the bottom as well. And then maximum building height, so same thing, specify the zone and what type of structure is required to, there's some exceptions for accessory structures, so we've listed the full gamut of building height requirements in this section. And then once again, the footnotes here down at the bottom list all the different, special requirements underneath the notes section here at the bottom. Moving on to just further in Chapter 4 here, we've got exceptions to height regulations. And so we've relocated this from currently in Chapter 6. Setbacks, we've really created a new section here in order to address setback requirements. We provided a definition of what setbacks are, how you measure setbacks. So a lot of these things were hidden within different definitions at the very end of our code, and unless you were working with it every day, it was hard to navigate and figure out what those were. And so we've tried to pull all those out of the definition section, put them in this one succinct area under setbacks, and try to have everything that you would need in order to have the exceptions and how you interpret it, where you measure from. Put all that underneath this section of setbacks and have it in one location. Permitted projections into required setbacks, so like unwalled porches, we allow you to, eaves, allow you to encroach a certain distance. That's been relocated from Chapter 6. Exceptions to required setbacks. We, for things that are less than 30 inches in height, like decks, you have some exceptions, but that was one of the things that was hidden in our definition section that you didn't really, know was there if you were, architect, engineer, member of the public, and weren't dealing with it every day. So located that there. Alternate front yard setback, that's just been relocated, stays the same. Setbacks for flag lots, that's always just been a historical, really, interpretation of our department of how you measure setbacks for flag lots. And so instead of just having that as pretty much department policy, it's better to have it in the code so you know. So we've clarified narrative of how to measure flag lot setbacks, and then relocated access to lots and buildings. That's just been largely stayed the same, just been moved from Chapter 6. And we wanted to insert some illustrations, picture's worth 1,000 words sometimes, and so just did some illustrations in order to be able to convey those setback requirements. A lot of the times when you're dealing with, especially properties that are in older areas of town, you're not necessarily measuring from the property line. If you're a local street, you're measuring from the back edge of the sidewalk. And so it provides a good diagram in order to illustrate, exactly where your property lines tend to be, where the sidewalks are, where your setback lines are, your building envelope here, and just really gives you a good way to visualize what the requirements are. And then, this is our flagpole lot setback measurement. And really the tricky thing is just the front setback, where we take, center of the flag and do a radius of the front setback, and then everything else pretty much becomes your side, and then you've got your rear and the back. So even with the narrative description that we've included, it's still a little hard to visualize, and so I think this helps a whole lot in order to get that across. Checking for time here. So Chapter 6, this is our supplementary regulations. We've just got, a lot of these things have been moved, all these sections have been moved from this chapter and put in other locations, and so that is a lot of what we're doing here, just relocating a lot of these sections. Curb cuts, that's actually being proposed to be eliminated. We have curb cut requirements within our engineering construction standards, and so right now there are 2 different locations. We don't control, as community development, we don't control curb cuts. It's engineering department and public works that do, and so it's always been odd that we've had this in our code, and then engineering has the same thing in their street standards as well, or construction standards. And so instead of having it in 2 locations where if you change anything you have to go in and change both locations, we were just going to leave it in the location of the department that administers the curb cut requirements and take it out of the zoning code. And so that's what we're proposing to do there. Off-street parking requirements, and so really the substantive change here is when we did the off-street parking ordinance this last year, we ended up with the table, and so we have a lot of the old uses and then a parking requirement. So maybe it's 1 parking stall for every 200 square feet, depending upon what use you have. We're waiting, so we have our new use table, and we've got all the different, a lot of the commercial terminology has changed a little bit because we've adopted the NIAX system. And so there was a lot of uses that weren't listed as well. That was, it was always hard to, we had to render an interpretation or look at a use that was similar, and, the onus was on staff a lot of the times in order to come up with what an appropriate calculation was, just because of the shortness of the use list. And so what we had done there was taken every use that we have in the use table and just applied a parking standard to it based upon what we had before. And so looking at a lot of the uses and then the similar uses, and then rearranging those standards. And then this is something the comp plan actually directed us to do, was to go away from more of a, try to do more of static numbers. So you have some requirements that are based upon number of employees. Well, any business, as you know, can increase and decrease employees at any time during the year. And so when you have a parking requirement that's based upon the number of employees that fluctuates, it's hard to keep track of that as staff, and it's hard to, it could pretty easily go out of compliance if you're the business owner, or, for whatever use. And so we've tried to establish more static ways of defining parking requirements, and it's usually based upon per square footage, or maybe it's a school, it's per classroom. And so we've gone through and converted a lot of those parking requirements away from the per employee basis to more of a static per square footage or per classroom, or type of thing. So that's what's changed in the off-street parking requirements. The remainder is pretty much moved the same, or stayed the same. We've got loading requirements, performance standards, which has been relocated. And this is the parking table. So we've got the same structure, residential uses, non-residential uses, and then we've got all the calculations here on the right. So, gone away. So like archery shooting range, 1.5 per firing lane, per square footage, per hole. So largely just, shifting towards more of a per square footage basis on a lot of these. The remainder of the section here, the remainder of the chapter, we've just done a little reorganizing, moved some of these. We do have a small amendment to the sign code that's being incorporated as part of this project, and so this is really to accommodate some larger properties that you generally see in certain zones. So right now, like for instance, our central business zone has a maximum square footage cap on that zone, and so you look at maybe a lot that has a business that's 20, 30 feet wide and it just has frontage on Main Street. A little different scenario than, for instance, like the Gritman Medical Office Building that is in central business as well, but it takes up pretty much one entire city block and it's a really large building. And so, the way our sign code is right now, it just puts that cap, but doesn't really change depending upon the size of the lot or the building that's on the lot. And so we tried to accommodate that, as well as you have a number of institutional uses, thinking of like the Nazarene Church that takes up, probably say that's 2-3 city blocks in either direction, that takes up, the amount of space. And so you have a lot of the same issues with residential zones where you have a cap on the square footage that you can have, but it doesn't take into consideration the size of the lot or the building. And so what we've done is eliminated a lot of the caps and just let the amount of signage dictate what gets put up. And so within each zone, you still have a certain amount of like monument sign, freestanding sign. And so that really restricts it and allows you to have more signage if you have 4 street frontages, because you're allowed 1 freestanding sign per street frontage. And so we just, we're looking towards a shift in order to regulate signage a little bit differently to accommodate for these large size properties, and that's what we've done here with the sign code amendment. And then the remainder has stayed the same. So we've got fences, outdoor lighting that will remain there. Chapter 11, believe that the only thing that's happened here is just relocated those 2 sections to Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. And then, of course, the definitions, we've moved to Chapter 1. And then all of our specific use standards, those have been relocated to Chapter 3. So there is one, and Planning and Zoning did conduct a public hearing on this, and they recommended approval. They had one small change to just the hierarchy of bullet points within the very beginning, and it wasn't substantive at all. It was just more of a correctly listing one of the bullet points, and didn't change anything pretty much other than that. I did want to direct your attention to one item that we have amended since Planning and Zoning conducted the public hearing, and it was for educational services. And I will, it probably presents a good opportunity to be able to show you kind of the NIAX structure and how it actually all works with the codes. And so what we've done, if you look at educational services, so we've got this superscript, which is C19, conditional use, and then at the bottom it says elementary schools, secondary schools, and other schools, and instruction only as defined by NIAX code numbers 6111 and 6116. And so if you look at the code, the NIAX code section, so you have the main sector, which is educational services. And this is the nice thing about the NIAX terminology, the NIAX listing, is that you're able to list a wide range of uses underneath the different sectors, and you don't have to individually list all of these uses. It's just inherent that they're all underneath the different sectors. And so we have all these categories that are underneath educational services. So we've got elementary, secondary schools, junior colleges, universities, professional schools, business schools, technical trade schools, other schools in instruction, and educational support services, and then it's got more detail underneath here. Once we went to the NIAX codes, we used to draw a distinction between like colleges, universities, and elementary and secondary schools in the code. Well, now they're all under educational services. And so, looking back at all the allowed uses underneath here, we don't think that it would be appropriate to have college or universities in a primarily residential zone except for maybe multifamily. And so we've gone back and just added this footnote down here, which just basically says that the only schools, the only educational services that are allowed within ag forest through R3 and residential are going to be elementary, secondary, and other schools and instruction only. The other schools and instruction only are going to be like fine arts schools, sports and rec, language schools, things, schools that we still think would be appropriate in a residential setting. And so that is one thing that we, going back and looking through and talking about that a little bit, that's one change that we did make since planning and zoning. So just wanted to make sure you were aware of that. But like I mentioned, the commission did conduct a public hearing that happened on April 11th. And I would recommend forwarding the item to public hearing upon the proposed ordinance at the council's upcoming meeting next Monday, May 21st.
This is a gargantuan amount of work. Thank you for being as caring to get this right. I think it sounds very intuitive and very clear, and honestly, kind of motivates me to want to go back through it and read it now. It's going to make sense. So thank you for that. Do you guys have any questions? I know you've lived it for quite a while, and
It's great to see it come together.
yeah.
Very pleased with it.
Thank you.
It's been forever long. I have a few little notes here, but they're kind of wordsmithy and questions like that, so I'll nail you afterwards.
Okay.
If I might.
Okay.
Something to look forward to there, for sure.
Oh, it's riveting stuff.
Wordsmithy is always fun to get nailed afterwards.
Yes.
So our action is do we agree? We want to recommend forwarding the item for public hearing on the proposed ordinance
Yes, please.
on May 21? Does that sound good to you? Okay, let's move forward. I'm sorry, somebody in the...
Can we ask questions?
I believe that you can, Council President. Come on up here. Catherine Bonzo, our Council President, has some questions for you. Mike.
Brandy, did you also have a question about this specific one? Okay, perfect.
Awesome.
Yeah, mine had to do with, we did the survey question on the educational institution and the commission survey. And I was wondering if that coordinated with what you all were doing in the table.
Well, I mean, it did in the sense that I presented that information to planning and zoning prior to public hearing of this.
Okay.
So we covered that information in the survey results from that question. We didn't necessarily go back and look at the use table and where that use was allowed or where it wasn't allowed, and have a discussion. We just had a brief discussion that night at the Planning and Zoning Commission meeting about that question. And, I think one commission member just had a little concern about which direction. There was a little ambiguity there and which, what that response was actually telling you or not.
Well, the reason I brought it up is because it took a while to craft the question, to try to get some information to be helpful, for a document like this. And so that I was kind of just curious if it had any help in delineating where, because that had always been a conditional use permit in the CBD, if that helped clarify that. But it sounds like it wasn't a question for them.
Well, they definitely had a discussion about it. I think that it helped reaffirm their sense in going towards, leaving it as a conditional use permit in central business, mainly because there was, as I recall, a relatively high response rate that it should be a conditional use permit within that zone. And so I think one commission member made a comment about, just more of the economic activity that schools that either inside central business or directly adjacent to central business bring towards getting people downtown and to downtown businesses. And so there was one of the members did make a comment about that.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that. I was just wanting to follow up on that because it's been a process to try to gather information about that after all the conditional use permits that happened.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, and we had 2 questions, I believe, from planning and zoning, and then that one was added. So they were unaware of that, but I presented all of them. And so, yep, they discussed it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Okay, we still recommend forwarding this item for public hearing on the 21st.
Okay,
Okay,
thank you.
thank you very much. That is our last item. Do I hear a motion to adjourn from either
Let's
one of you?
vote.
All right, awesome. Thank you very much.